So we're starting today the other substitution lab. And for this lab, we need about 7 grams of sodium bromide, which is here. I did weigh it, so we're going to transfer it into a 100 milliliter round bottom flask. So you slowly transfer it down there. So that's my first step. I got my sodium bromide here. The second step is to add the butanol right here. I did measure the volume and the mass. And then we're going to measure in here some DI water, which is 6 milliliters. Now, since this is not part of the calculation, you don't have to be precise. But what I like to do is rinse off what is left over with that DI water. This way, not only did we rinse the alcohol that was in the graduated cylinder, but also rinsed off the sodium bromide that's in the weighing boat. So slowly rinse your weighing boat with DI water. So now we have our mixture, alcohol, water, and sodium bromide. Next thing, we're going to drop stir bar, magnetic stir bar. And I have here, ready to go, an ice bath. It's kind of half filled. So what I'm going to do is attach the round bottom flask to the lattice. Remember, you always attach the clamp first to the round bottom flask. So this is as low as I can go with the round bottom flask. I can add a few more crystals of ice. It's already a pretty cold water there. Now the reason we're adding ice here is the reaction is very exothermic. We're going to add concentrated sulfuric acid, and you know that it's best to keep it cold. So it's been already sitting there. This is water and ice. And I'm going to add 8 milliliters of sulfuric acid. So using the same graduated cylinder, you're going to measure 8 milliliters of sulfuric acid. And since it's the catalyst, you don't have to go and be super precise. So here we go, we have roughly 8 milliliters. So what I'll do next is add the acid to the reaction mixture, but before I go there, I'm going to start the stirring. So when you use a magnetic stir bar, make sure it's centered on the hot plate and make sure your heat is off. So here you can see it's being stirred, and I'm going to add the sulfuric acid 1 milliliter at a time. You don't have to do it 1 drop at a time, but 1 milliliter at a time is okay. And pretty much the last milliliter, I'm going to pour it in. So now that I added all the sulfuric acid and we kept it cold, we need to move to the next step, which is reflux. And the reflux, we need to heat it. So before we heat it, we have to turn off the stirring first. Lower the jack. Make sure you remove your round bottom flask from the ice bath. So now I'm going to set up the reflux. Now reflux means we're going to heat it and make sure that the vapor doesn't escape. So we want to cool the vapor using the condenser. Remember when we did the distillation, the condenser must always have the tubing before you attach it to your round bottom flask. And since we're going to have glass touching glass, it's always a good idea to have a little bit of grease in here. So we're going to put a little grease on the condenser, and then put it there. And now this is ready. I don't have to put a beaker, but it's nice if, in case something breaks, at least it's contained there. Actually, we can do without it. So I'm going to make sure we have constant stirring. So first the stirring process. And since we're going to run some water, we don't want the water line to touch a hot plate, so have to be careful about that. So here we're going to attach the water line here and make sure the water runs correctly in your condenser. It has to come from the bottom up. So here we go, trying to set up the flow. And you see how the water is filling up the condenser? And now we have a steady flow of water. Leave it in the sink. And again, make sure it doesn't touch the hot plate. Then we're going to start to heat it. We'll put the setting here at 300. But remember, 300 is not really degrees Celsius. We're going to heat it slowly. We're going to leave it there. So we finished the 45 minutes. I just want to show you a little bit how this reflux is working pretty well, because the vapor is not going any higher than this level. And also, if you see up close, there's a little oily layer on top, which is our final product. So when we're done now, we can turn off everything and lower the hot plate to make sure that the flask cools off. So we need to let it sit for a while to cool off. And I just want to mention again, earlier, maybe when I did the setup, after you set it up, it's always a good idea to secure your condenser onto the lattice. It was pretty sturdy, but you never know. If the water pressure changes, anything can happen. So it's always safe. It's better to be safe than sorry. So that's the reason it's always a good idea to attach any piece of glassware to the lattice. So now that the reaction mixture is cold, we cooled it off. It's not completely cold, but it's slightly warm, so it's okay. We need to dismantle this whole setup. First step is turn off the water. And here, make sure you remove the water tubing from the faucet to empty the condenser. So that's the first step. Turn off the water, empty the condenser. And just like when we build things, we build them from the bottom up. In here, we're going to unbuild them from the top down. So we're going to remove the clamp to release the condenser. So now the condenser can go here. The second step is to remove your round bottom flask. And it's always a good idea to have a cork ring ready for it before you remove it. Our round bottom flask is ready to be, our mixture is ready to be extracted. What you do to your reaction mixture is you add DI water. You add it twice, about 5 milliliters each time, and you swirl. And this is basically to dissolve any extra sodium bromide that didn't react. And we still have here the stir bar, the magnetic stir bar. But before you transfer anything, make sure your stopcock is closed and you transfer your liquid. So what I need to do here is to rinse off all of this. And the magnetic stir bar is stuck in the funnel. So you can remove it like this. And at this point, you're going to do the extraction. And you start to see that there's like an oily material that started to separate. So you have to let it sit for a while until the two layers separate. There's obviously an oily little droplet there. So we're going to allow them to move up. And then we do the first extraction. So what I did is I added about 20 milliliters of water to dissolve all the extra sodium bromide or any salt that has formed. And you can see that the water, the aqueous layer is at the top with little oily material, but then the bottom here is definitely our organic layer. The extraction is not complete because we still have some of it here. So what we're going to do is remove it, remove the part that already separated in a clean Erlenmeyer flask. And then every time we remove, we let it sit a little bit to separate more. So I'm going to let it sit. And I know that my organic layer is right here, but I still need to see. You can do a few things here to help it out. You swirl a little bit, just like this. Of course, without spilling it, make sure you don't spill it, and you start to see that it does separate better. You start to see that the bottom layer has that oily material start to accumulate. So you swirl and you let it sit, you swirl and you let it sit, until eventually you extract the entire organic layer. So what we did is we extracted the organic layer, which was at the bottom, which is here, and the aqueous layer, we collected it in a beaker. So now the next step is to rinse off our organic layer. And what does it mean, rinse it off? It had some concentrated acid, so we want to get rid of that acid. So the best thing to do is to put it back into the separatory funnel, and then we're going to add some sodium hydroxide. I just measured sodium hydroxide, 5%. I'm using the same flask to rinse it off to make sure like all my substance is in there. And then we're going to extract it. So first step, as usual, whenever you use a separatory funnel, always hold the stopper, tilt it, shake a little bit, and vent. Shake a little bit. Don't overshake it because there is always a risk for an emulsion there. You can also swirl it a little bit and let it separate. So with 10 milliliters of sodium hydroxide, I think this is good enough to rinse it. And you start to see our organic layer is at the bottom. Because I added 10 milliliters, it's a lot more than my organic layer. So that's our first rinse. We're going to rinse it with sodium hydroxide. And I have a beaker here that says base wash, meaning the sodium hydroxide, which is on the top, will be collected here. And then the final rinse would be sodium chloride. Repeat the same. It So here's our last rinse. We're going to put about 5 pipette full of the sodium chloride. This is good enough. And we're going to do our last extraction with sodium chloride. So again, you mix, swirl a little bit. And you let it separate. And you start to see the two layers forming. So basically, the last step is to transfer our organic layer in a dry, clean Erlenmeyer flask. And we're going to add some drying agent, which is calcium chloride. So you see that we have a nice separation here. So this is my last step, is to collect my organic layer in a dry, clean 50 ml Erlenmeyer flask. So I'm going to just collect it. And once I collected my organic layer, you need to dry it out by using a few pellets of the calcium chloride. So I put about 5 pellets there. That's good enough. And you can swirl it and let it do its work. So 5 minutes later, so while I let it sit and do its work, the calcium carbonate, I did pre-weigh a little vial. Make sure you put the weigh of your vial with the cap. And now the last step is to transfer my final product into the vial and weigh it to calculate the percent yield. So with a clean pipette, Pasteur pipette, you just transfer your liquid. So when you see that you pretty much collected to the last drop, of course you're going to have a little bit of a waste, because a loss of chemical, because the calcium chloride will absorb some of your substance. I feel like this is good enough. And we are done. Now before we completely finish, we say we're done, we need to take care of all the waste. So remember, how do we take care of the waste? All of it, ideally, collect it in a big container, all together. And then I would even rinse all my containers with some water. Collect all the waste in the same container. Rinse everything. So I used a round bottom flask. I used the graduated cylinder. I'm going to rinse it. I'm also going to rinse the flasks that I have. And then don't forget to discard the Pasteur pipette in a glass, in the solid waste container. Here we're going to collect again every single waste in a big beaker. And then the last step, you put all of this in the organic waste and you wash everything with soap and water, rinse it with some alcohol, and put it away. Thank you.